Hi, it's Dr. Ann Metz, and this is the Psychedelic Skeptic, where we believe nothing is the cure for everything. If it's your first time here, I'm a licensed therapist, counseling professor, and in fact, a psychedelic therapist. But I'm also a skeptic when it comes to some of the claims around psychedelic medicine. And that's what I'm here to explore. Today on the show, can altered states lead to altered systems?
My motto these days is it's easier to think of the end of the world than to think of the end of capitalism. And we do seem to be in this weirdly apocalyptic vibe where nature is just collapsing. And how do we get people to feel like they're stakeholders in change?
On today's episode of The Psychedelic Skeptic, we have the pleasure of welcoming Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky. Paul is a multi-talented artist currently serving as the artist in residence at Yale University. Paul is the sort of person who has something original to say about just about it. Our conversation spans psychedelics, architecture, time, and of course, music. This was an especially meaningful conversation for me because I've been trying to make a connection between the climate crisis and psychedelics in my own head. And I think Paul offers a pretty compelling narrative beyond the obvious application of psychedelics as a way to help us cope with the trauma of environmental catastrophe. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. And if you're interested in attending the Psycha event in New York or getting involved in the organization, I've included links in the show notes. Here's DJ Spooky. I'm curious about how you got involved with the climate crisis and with being an activist in that area.
I'm a firm believer that information and knowledge and how we think about the arts, it's about biodiversity, but also intellectual diversity. When I was first starting DJing, I've always had a position where politics and the arts have been part of my vocabulary, and it's just seamless. I took a studio to Antarctica in 2011, a long time ago, and was working with National Geographic. And since then, I've been heavily involved with kind of climate activism in the arts over the years. I try as much as possible to incorporate what I call climate awareness and the idea of climate literacy into what I do. Infamous phrase says brevity is the soul of wit. But to me, simplicity and accessibility are to be desired. And so the arts is a good way of conveying climate issues and getting that conversation started in a more robust way between scientists and artists.
You mentioned that you went to Antarctica. Do you think of yourself as an outdoorsy person?
Oh, very much. Yeah. I just bought a place upstate in an area called Beaverkill / Roscoe / Livingston Manor. And amusingly enough, I go hiking and things like that. But normally I lived in Colorado for years and I loved going hiking there. The problem with being on the East Coast is that, again, you have to think about biodiversity, biocomplexity. And there's ticks with Lyme disease. And in fact, we're now getting, because of climate change and all the temperature differentials, the tick population is exploding.
Mhm.
And so is the population of deer that carries them. So we're in the middle of this entire bizarre, both a pandemic, ticks and the viruses they carry, but also regretfully, the deer population is also going through a huge trauma. And when I drive back and forth to the city and upstate, you just see an incredible amount of deer by the highway, smashed by cars. And yeah, so anyway, long story short, yes, I'm an outdoor person.
Yeah. I'm a shrink, so I'm always curious about people's early memories of being in nature. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is kind of a hybrid city. And the reason I say it's a hybrid is that the park, Rock Creek Park, was one of the first major parks to really intervene in an urban landscape in such a way that the entire city, the park kind of transverses through the main portion of the city.
Mm.
So I would go hiking and bicycle riding down there. When I say down, because usually, have you ever been to DC?
Oh, yeah. I'm from Virginia originally, and I'm pretty familiar with Rock Creek Park. So
Okay.
that's great. Cool.
Yeah, I grew up near DuPont Circle, but I also grew up near Silver Spring. So I used to ride my bike from Silver Spring down to DuPont Circle. And one of the best and most pleasant ways to do that was to ride your bike down through the park instead of down 16th Street. And if you rode on 16th Street, you're on DC's on a grid, and it's a utopian design because the grid was meant to convey like the logic of the future of cities. So you can see long geometric spaces, rectangles, like the Lincoln Monument, for example, which came much later, but they built it in so that there was a lot of open space and green. And that kind of, if you're growing up in DC, you have this paradox of the local versus the federal. And the federal buildings are all these massive structures. And you realize that you're in this sort of imperial city with radically bizarre paradoxes of class, race, and economics flying around. And DuPont Circle is where all the embassies are. And so there was a very cosmopolitan approach to that as well. And there was a punk rock scene, and you had Ronald Reagan.
Oh, yeah. There's a punk rock scene, and then there's also, what is the DC music that's playing? Go-go, yeah. Unka Chunka.
Yeah. So it's actually incredibly polyrhythmic and incredibly African sounding when you hear it. It's this super hybrid between African polyrhythms and poly kind of polyphony, but also just raw, really good funk bass lines. I've always surprised that it never caught on as much as it should have. It's wildly popular in a very specific area of DC.
DC has this character that is unrelated to the federal government and that is unrelated to the kind of seat of politics. It's like truly its own unique culture.
Yeah, one could argue DC is the original African city. If you look at like the origin of jazz, which a lot of people would trace to New Orleans, but in America during the slave period, if you played West African rhythms and if you played anything that was non-European, they would punish you brutally. The slaves figured out incorporating gospels, church music, stuff like that into their kind of practice. But what's fascinating is that it went the other direction. It pulled from that and then went spiraling out into some quantum weirdness where you have African funk with this kind of 70s disco funk. And growing up with that and punk rock as your two soundtracks to your childhood definitely left me feeling it doesn't match anything else in America. If you look at country music, if you look at like Chicago, New York, country music obviously there's a deep structural relationship with a lot of African American music, and blues obviously than country. I'm always fascinated with the archaeology of the time, like how we layer culture into the practice of everyday life, that's here I am in a skyscraper. And these buildings, if you look around, there's an architectural practice at work that's culture as well. Yeah.
Maybe I should switch us back to the topic of conversation, which is your involvement in the Psychedelics for Climate Action group, Psycha. Can you tell me a little bit about the organization and what it's seeking to do?
Sure. The organization was catalyzed by Marissa Feinberg, who's an interesting figure from New York. I met her at this spot called The Secret Space, which is a popular sort of watering hole for artists and creatives here in New York. We eventually met and we are like, hey, let's throw a mashup of our styles. Like I'll help curate a little bit of a science aesthetic and how we think about science and the arts. But she had been dealing with psychedelics and the climate crisis, which to me, I was like, walk me through that. What does that mean?
Good, because I was going to say, walk me through that, Paul.
Yeah. So we met, we had a series of debates and discussions. Here's my take on it, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with her if you want to hear her take on it. I firmly believe that the human mind in our context of an information or data-driven society is being bombarded with algorithms. The algorithms are essentially driving most mass narratives. In fact, I'm writing a book about that right now. It's called Digital Fiction, The Future of Storytelling. Now, if you unpack that, what is an algorithm? It's just math. But the human mind needs to struggle with that, the idea of stuff like natural language, how we think about creating meaning from patterns, and then we look at pattern recognition. So pattern recognition and algorithms have a pretty solid overlap. I'll give you a fun example. Here we are on Zoom. Every color that is in this frame and the way the camera is reacting, the way the light is being hit to the sensors, that's all math. Psychedelics is where you get to this weird place where all is one. You're as a human mind. I used to DJ Burning Man, which is a huge festival. Again, for the audience, if you don't know it, look it up. Just Burning Man. They burn a robot at the end of it. And Larry Harvey, the founder, was an associate of mine. Me and him did a series of debates for The Economist magazine on psychedelic economics. What is psychedelic economics, you may ask? The human mind is always searching for meaning. And one could argue we're addicted to that search. That's what language is. That's what meaning is. That's how we look at stories. So the stories we tell ourselves are basically like a nation state or a narrative structure that is a building. Those are all things that one could argue are just patterns. Psychedelics, again, from my perspective and the relationship to the climate crisis, is where the human mind accepts that we are part of nature. and nature itself is a kind of radical heterodoxy. It's not orthodoxy. It's just to say, all right, my body, your body, here we are on a digital screen looking at each other thousands of miles away from one another. How does that work? But if you were thinking about psychedelics in the same context, the list keeps going. Those are things that are what you call disintermediation. Like you have things like synesthesia. You have things like where your mind is reaching for more intuitive relationships. So
Mm.
again, I don't even do psychedelics that much. In fact, I haven't done it in ages, but I'm very respectful of the phenomena. And long story short, because I know people will come at me with this stuff, I'm a fan of this idea of constantly questioning your surroundings. And
Mm.
I think psychedelics is a good tool for critical thinking.
Absolutely. I guess it was Ram Dass had a saying that when you've got the message, you can hang up the phone. And it sounds like you've gotten the message of psychedelics, that we're all connected and that separation is really an illusion.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually cool. When you get the message, you can hang up the phone. But here's the catch. With psychedelics, you might start thinking, maybe if I didn't hang up the phone, then maybe what's the signal? Maybe what's the sound going to my mind? And you
Mm.
start this idea of an infinite hall of mirrors where each reflection and each thought bounces down this corridor of reflections. And I celebrate that. And that makes me think that we live in an era where everything is very rigidly categorized and we're in these weird silos, and psychedelics breaks down the silo.
Mm. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure. I'm a big fan of Paul Stamets
Mm.
and what he's been doing with critiquing how mushrooms and other kinds of natural forms in the planet, fungi, mycelial networks, forest root systems, humans have always dwelt in nature. We're not separate from nature. And the problem with the last several centuries with the Industrial Revolution par excellence is that there's a rationalism in European aesthetics that made people feel like they're separate and or above nature.
Mm.
And to me, at least, it's time to reclaim nature, but not nature itself, but our place in it. And that's where I think psychedelics is a good way to deprogram us out of several centuries of industrial thinking, like
Mm.
industrialization of the mind. And again, this is strictly my own take on it. I'm an artist. I'm a creative. I read a lot. That's all.
That was a really great explanation. Mycelia is like the ultimate system, and seeing ourselves as being part of the natural system instead of being somehow separate from it, I think is just it's like a metaphor for how we are, but it's also, I think, descriptive too.
Eerily enough, one could argue, again, if you're thinking about mycelial like root systems, there's two philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, that came with this term, the rhizome. I'm a big fan of that term.
Mm.
It means systems of roots. And if you think about moss, fungi, the roots of trees, plants, they're actually quite mathematical. And if you actually just dial out,
Mm.
if you think about just the internet itself, actually looks like these huge root systems. If you were just to compare all these networks and systems holding each other. But how does the human mind make sense out of all that? If you think about it, which again, thinking about thinking, the human mind is quite burdened with intelligence,
Mm.
and intelligence takes a lot of mental bandwidth. Sometimes it's nice to turn things off. I do that by doing stuff like Vipassana meditation or going into other forms of personally purging many of the huge data cloud of thoughts around us at every level. There's various studies that show that every platform we're on is an addiction engine. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're algorithmically set up to keep you engaged and your attention on the platform. So a lot of economists would say that's now an attention economy.
Mm.
And it's the production of your attention that drives the financing of these platforms. And so the engagement does things to your brain. The more you use platforms, the more your brain derives things like serotonin, dopamine, and so on. And yeah, psychedelics is still part of that conversation, but science is catching up to many of these issues and we're just figuring it all out, which I'm very grateful for. And that's what I'm thinking.
Hopefully, we haven't created too many unintended consequences along the way.
We live in a huge experiment right now. I
Yeah.
think the law of unintended consequences, nobody knows what this screen is doing to your eyes. Some people say turn on blue light at night, or some people say, okay, the screen is made of millions of pixels and the colors and the flashing, the stroboscopic effect. Right. Your screen isn't just a solid color. If you ever look at it sideways, you can see the lights are doing kind of this stroboscopic effect.
Mm.
Um, Like you ever see walk by somebody's apartment building at night, and you can see all these TV screens flickering and you don't even need to see the screen, but you realize the flicker. And there are studies that show people can actually be put into seizures because of flickering on TV screens, stuff like that. And how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Like electromagnetic fields,
Sure.
radiation from various stuff. And here I am talking to you with weird AirPods that are Bluetooth enabled.
Nothing could be weird about that.
Yeah. So all of that is doing stuff to us that will come out later that we've been living in the equivalent of William Blake's Satanic Mills, the poet William Blake, where we're just using these devices that are wildly toxic and filled with plastic and chemicals.
To what extent are we going to be seeing unintended consequences with psychedelics? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Again, I'm not that involved with the therapy movement, but I do know there's a huge momentum for both declassifying and descheduling. Obviously, cannabis was just rescheduled as from Schedule 1 to Schedule, I think, 3, if I remember correctly, which is, I personally think it should be legal at every level for both recreational and medicinal. But then with psychedelics, again, there's still a lot of back and forth on it all. Obviously, MDMA, ketamine, all these kind of substances that are slightly at the edge of the legal system. I haven't done psychotherapy, but I do have a philosophical take on it, which is I feel like the pharmaceutical industry is trying to figure out how to monetize and maximize profit. That's what they do.
Yeah.
So you can switch 1 or 2 molecules around in a pill or a substance, get a FDA approval, and a few of the shacklers or the huge corporations, you can have physicians start prescribing that. There is some merit to the argument that we now have an epidemic of all sorts of different mental health issues. And human beings have never lived like this before. We're talking to a screen. If I was in a different time period, they would say I'm talking to an angel or a ghost or a demon or in the screen. You could be burned at the stake. I mean, these are, again, I'm not a specialist. I'm just an artist who reads law.
Let's talk about art and psychedelics then. Do you consider your music to be psychedelic?
In the 90s, I was usually placed in this category called trip hop, like whether it was meant to be like a psychedelic hip hop or something. I think everything is psychedelic. So I'm the last person to put any kind of category in there. Anything that you listen to has a pleasure for the mind. So music itself is psychedelic. There's certain forms that may be more amenable to feeling psychedelic or feeling like some people, if you're in Europe, if you go to some German techno club, everyone's on MDMA and they're dancing with this kind of, or if you're in London, they're much more into other substances, which again, I'm a jogger and I'm a big fan of meditation.
If you're saying that all music is psychedelics, you wouldn't necessarily place yourself within like the genre of psychedelic music.
I guess I just always feel that I hate categories. I have a deep allergy to categories.
That works. You've written extensively and you've spoken about your ideas about music and sampling. I'm curious if you see any parallels between sampling within music and the issue of cultural appropriation within psychedelics. So for folks who are listening, a critique that's often launched at psychedelics is that we're taking these ancient indigenous traditions and we're medicalizing them and we're trying to profit from them.
Indigenous traditions were the cosmopolitan impulse of their time. So indigenous for the Aztecs, who also took substances, or indigenous for the Spanish who would drink a certain kind of wine, or indigenous for the Sami people, which is a tribe in the far north of Europe. They're a nomadic tribe that lives between Finland and Sweden, and they harvest reindeer, but they would still have certain kinds of substances that they would take. Human beings always enjoy that kind of disintermediation. From my perspective here in the 21st century, is that we now have this incredible encyclopedia of every crazy substance that could have been made throughout history. And we have the Wikipedia of the human mind as is on these substances. I'm intrigued by that. And I think that, again, as we move further into the 21st century, there's already a crazy arms race among psychopharmaceutical corporations to try and find various molecules. And now with AI, what they call protein folding, they're looking for newer substances to be able to activate all sorts of stuff. And again, AI is just the beginning to that. So we're going to be seeing a lot more newer novelty substances being generated. And again, there's an arms race with that, because if you're, say, for example, a chemist in China and you want to get past American FDA regulations, just switch a molecule out and send the package straight through the American mail. But I would say, just to go to the heart of your question, it's in rapid evolution right now. We're going to
Mm,
be seeing just, so indigenous traditions are evolving. They were, say, for example, ayahuasca is very popular among certain demographics here in New York. Um, I have some friends that go to that stuff. I don't, because again, I'm just somebody who celebrates this, but doesn't really need to take everything. But the ayahuasca scene was like psychedelic colonialism, because they'd like
mm,
fly in a shaman from Peru and they'd talk about the forest or something. But if people, I'm agnostic about everything. I'm like, look, if people get a kick out of it and they fly someone in from Peru, no problem. And the shaman wants to have everyone sing songs while they're taking ayahuasca or
mm.
peyote or something. Again, I'm really cosmopolitan about this.
No, I guess as I was thinking about that question and was reflecting on, how sampling is like a culture of taking a piece of music that from one artist and using it in a different way. And I wonder to what extent that's what we're doing and what we owe the original creators of these ideas. Do you have any thoughts about that?
To me, at least right now, I'm fascinated with how perception influences almost everything. So to go to the heart of that, in quantum physics, Einstein has a very famous phrase. He's like, imagine that the moon is there even if I'm not looking at it. He felt that if you're looking at quantum physics and how humanity inhabits our mind, and our mind is not separate from the body, there's weird overlaps between psychedelics, Buddhism, and quantum physics. And then on top of that, the pun here is, well, I think science is catching up to many of these indigenous traditions. The Romans, the Greeks,
Mm,
Peruvians. These are places where they had a long-term relationship to ecstatic being. Like by learning, they revered the shaman or the oracle. Or, but for us, who is that? An influencer on TikTok? What
yeah.
is it? So I'm just at a crossroads about it all, mainly because we're in warp speed moving forward into all this crazy stuff. The iPhone barely existed even 10 years ago. And now, obviously, the idea of mobile computing, your
Mm,
average cell phone has more computational power that would have put somebody on the moon in the 60s and 70s. So, what does that do to your mind? If your average person stares and interacts with their phone over 3,000 times a day, and they're engaging more with their phone than with a person. But if their phone is a portal to all these other modalities of expression and socialization, your brain is trying to figure that out. And that's
mm,
neuroplasticity. So again, from the viewpoint of the arts, this is like incredible, because think about it. Even just 100 years ago, most of the mediums that I'm using, turntables, computers, sampling, collage, it would have been impossible. My entire career and life would have been impossible.
mm,
It's like saying you're asking an artist to paint with a brush, but they haven't even imagined a paintbrush.
mm.
And so go back even a little bit further, and photography didn't exist. All I can say is these are all things that we're experimenting with. We're learning. Our societies are evolving.
I have one last question about psychedelics, and then I have a silly question to ask you.
Mhm.
As I said, I'm a psychedelic therapist. I'm not sure if you've heard it, but Johns Hopkins has this playlist that they've created, and they've used it for every single session and all of their clinical trials. I sent you the link, but I'm not sure if you got a chance to look at it.
Yeah, I got that. And I was like, huh. Uh,
Any
I,
thoughts?
I, I think that would work, but everything can be tailored to the individual. And so, yeah, the Johns Hopkins psilocybin playlist. Amusingly enough, taste is very subjective. But the funny thing is, there's probably an algorithm for that. If you like these certain amount of songs, you put in your taste and your whatever preference. I'm sure that there's things that algorithmically could be quote unquote recommended for you to have meaning for you. If you're in Norway and you like heavy metal, with the music of the Norway, it's called black metal. And they have this huge thing for heavy metal in Norway, Norwegian metal. But you don't like hearing ayahuasca experiences from
Panpipes.
like a Peruvian shaman. That's not going to speak to you. Maybe I
Yeah.
don't know.
So
um,
no thoughts of doing a psychedelic therapy album?
you just struck a chord. I would do that.
Just
Um,
making a personal plea for something that I would like to have.
I would need to explore that more.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just processing on that. That's an idea. That's a really good idea. Let me think about it. But yeah, I'm a big fan. Do you know Brian Eno's work?
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Huge
he's an
fan.
old associate. Yeah, he does a lot of ambient electronic music. That's when people meditate to or get into whatever. And I'm a fan of that. Let me process on that. That is so cool. That's a great idea.
Oh, I think it would be amazing, and therapists would love it, clients would love it. It would be a cool way to integrate great art into the therapeutic process. It just needs to be 4 to 5 hours. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
Well, let's view that as the beginning of a conversation. I would love to do like a music for playlist kind of thing. That would be really cool. And I think there's a tremendous amount of possibilities there. And also the way that electronic music can be infinitely configured. I think that's a very good possibility. In a certain sense, you know what? You just blow my mind. And here's why. I can almost imagine that as a groundbreaking thing where you work with composers and the artists to come up with different kinds of approaches to generating music and then use that as part of these. The Johns Hopkins stuff is very specific.
Yeah, it's all classical for folks who aren't familiar with it.
And it's like classical stuff. And I'm just looking at it now, like Gurecki and these kinds of other stuff that to me, as someone who's involved with hip hop and techno and dubstep, maybe it would speak to me. I'd have to try it out. But my assumption is that each culture and segment of our culture is going to have all these interdisciplinary sounds that appeal to your core psychology. So, say, for example, if you're from like Compton and you're used to like Kendrick Lamar, and then somebody plays you Gurecki or Penderecki, does that trigger a psilocybin response to you? Or do you feel like, man, turn that Vivaldi or Gurecki off and they're not going to thumbs down? Meanwhile, something like Brian Eno, which you call generative music, you could program an algorithm to maybe curate music that would respond better to that person's psychology.
I had a client who was Jewish and really loved traditional music. I think it was culturally evocative in a way that ultimately really helped the therapeutic process, because so much of what we're dealing with when we're working with psychedelics is generational trauma.
So from my perspective, there's a deeper and even weirdly deeper relationship between DNA, trauma, and how trauma moves between generations. Well, there are two studies that I do. Again, I read Scientific American pretty actively. I read all sorts of other journals, but the one about the displacement of trauma through genetics is fascinating. And I'll forward you an article or two. By the way, so by the time we're done with this conversation, there'll be a bunch of little articles in your inbox there. But
You have a busy afternoon.
I really like your idea. It's a very cool idea.
Silly question, but I'm just curious, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you cope with serial disappointment?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Give her a scale of 1 to 10, how I cope with serial disappointment. I would say I'm probably in the middle, like a 5, because everything is malleable and everything is changeable. I don't really believe in determinacy. I think that we have agency and it can all change, and you can easily change that. If you're feeling or disappointed, then you need to move to have a better outcome. So I guess I'd be a person that would not necessarily say that I'm quote unquote suffering from any
serial disappointment. Serial disappointment. You're pretty good with it. You're an artist. How could you not be? I am a ceramicist, and like when I do things on the wheel, they fall apart. And it's been a great lesson in learning to let go and learning to accept that things don't work out. So I'm probably projecting that onto you as a quality that you've developed over the course of your career.
The idea of serial disappointment is intriguing as a condition of modern life, because everyone, I think we're pumped up with all sorts of expectations, and everything seems like the world is failing, nature's collapsing, climate change is destruction, capitalism is insatiable. And my motto these days is it's easier to think of the end of the world than to think of the end of capitalism. And we do seem to be in this weirdly apocalyptic vibe where nature is just collapsing. And how do we get people to feel like they're stakeholders in change, and that change is, I'll give you a funny example. Here we are, we're on 14th Street. Now, I want you to analyze this. You see all skyscrapers.
Right.
Now, you may ask, why is that? Here's why. New York is built on certain kinds of stone and rock. And because of that, 14th Street and above, that's where a lot of the skyscrapers are. Whereas on the west side and below on 13th Street, but when I go upstairs, I'll show you this from the above. You can only build certain kind of buildings in this area, but below, the bedrock is too fragile. So they can't build huge skyscrapers. So they only build low buildings. So all the skyscrapers are above, and then below 14th, it's mostly low buildings, the East Village, West Village. And then later, when you get further down to Wall Street, all of a sudden you get skyscrapers again. And it's all because of the bedrock. So there's different
Interesting.
kinds
So
of,
it's kind of mushy in the village.
yeah. And you can, if you built a big building there, it would start slowly collapsing and
Oh,
having a serious problem. I find that amusing and quirky, just as like the way geography shapes the city and the city then shapes your mind. And the funny thing is, we're responding to the retreat of glaciers. All of New York was shaped by the retreat of the glaciers 15,000 years ago.
mhm.
And this all used to be under ice, by the way. It's just wild, but here we are. And I'm sitting in a 21st century skyscraper with high speed internet. Yet everything I'm doing has been shaped by an action of a retreating glacier 15,000 years ago. And so I just talk about that because deep time and the idea that the human mind engages in these kind of larger structural things unconsciously. I walk down 14th Street, I look up and I'm like, oh, there's skyscrapers. We walk up Fifth Avenue, oh, skyscrapers. Anyway, serial disappointment. I think I love your content. We're gonna stay in touch about this. This is to the audience. This is just the beginning of a good conversation.
Do you want to talk about the event on Tuesday?
The event on Tuesday is at the Athenaeum, and it's with the New York Psychedelics Against Climate Action Group, spearheaded by Marissa Feinberg, who's a wonderful theoretician and cosmopolitan maven of thinking about the role of psychedelics in changing the mind. I support that. So I'm participating and I'm going to be doing an electronic music kind of party on one hand. And earlier in the night, we're going to have kind of a guided sense of meditation and a conversation about these issues that we've been talking about. I'm a nerd and I like high level content. So I'm always fascinated with the nerdiness of things. So you guys can all come out and check it out. We'll all
Great.
nerd out about the potential
Yes.
psychedelics.
And I will put the link in the show notes so you can get tickets, and also put the link in the show notes for Psycha. So for folks want to get involved. But yeah, let's go to the roof.
So here we are on top of a skyscraper. Do you see the New York landscape?
I can see the New York landscape.
Okay, so this is 13th Street.
Uh-huh.
Notice like why there's no tall buildings, right? So I'm going to
Right.
show you down, like looking down, hopefully not dropping my phone. We're on the top of a building here. And this is all geologic formations. And again, I'm a nerd here. So the article I sent you, I'm
Mhm.
using it was where I got skyscraper economist. And they realized the entire economy of New York, it's incredible because the actual buildings shape the economy, obviously. And the economy is a reflection of human industrial activity.
Yeah.
And that's all because 14th Street is where the boundary of the bedrock is, because the glacier went off. Are you seeing all this?
Yeah, I'm seeing all this. It also explains like whenever I'm below 14th Street in New York, I get lost and confused.
Hey, that's the old city.
Yeah.
And that was where the British built certain foundations, and the streets are there more like London, and they're curving and they're weird and off. And then as the city evolved, the grid kicked in, and that's where they realized they were able to maximize value by putting a grid. Central Park used to be a black village. And I always chuckle about this because the whites, which was what they did, they came in and kicked all the black people out of it. It was a wealthy and middle class and international and also multicultural city. And the rest of the whites didn't like that because it was multicultural. So they took over the whole Central Park, got rid of the black people, bulldozed all the buildings, and made this park for very wealthy people. And there's a movement now for reparations around that.
Hmm.
It was called Seneca Village. Actually, Central Park is the most expensive real estate on the planet. It's worth over $1 trillion by square foot.
Hmm.
So if you gave every black person in America a couple $1,000 because of the value of Central Park, I don't want to sell Central Park, but I do think that there is some clever hack that we could make reparations as part of the dynamic rebalancing of the economy, because I always chuckle about that.
It's a great example of reciprocity, of recognizing that we owe something to the communities that we have taken things from. And you just answered my earlier question.
These things are very real, and those economics disrupt people for generations and cause serious problems. And society, one could argue, just giving people a little bit of restorative justice would probably go a long way.
Yeah.
And it has been an absolute treat meeting you. And I just hope that we can continue. I like this idea of the playlist.
Oh,
I'm going to be thinking about that a lot.
good, because I'm going to be following up. DJ spooky psychedelic therapy music would be incredible.
I have to do some research and read up on it, but I think there's some potentiality there. I just need to read about it, think about it, and percolate. That's my nickname these days. I need to percolate on getting the best version of your coffee.
The Psychedelic Skeptic was created by me, Dr. Ann Metz. I had production help this week from Jesse Dukes and Jordan Taylor. Our podcast music is by Wes Swing. The Psychedelic Skeptic is available on your favorite podcast app. And you can learn more at annmetz.com or follow me on Instagram at Dr. Metz. If you want to recommend a guest for the show or ask a question about psychedelic therapy, just send me a note at hello@annmetz.com. If you want to help the podcast, please share it with a friend or a family member. Or if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.